Hi, my name is Sarah Moran. My pen name is SG Moran, and today let's talk about Henry V. So, I've been reading a lot of nonfiction in the Harvard Classics collection lately, but I also have been trying to expand my Shakespeare reading. Henry V I picked up actually because town my state's Shakespeare and the Parks Company is going to be doing Henry V as one of their plays this summer, and I realized that I had never read it, and I decided now would be a great time to read it before the play comes around and before I get to see the play, which I am very excited for. So I picked up Henry V. It's not really the type of Shakespeare book that I would naturally gravitate towards. Most of the time, I go for the more well-known tragedies like Macbeth and Hamlet and King Lear. But this is actually one of my aunt's favorite Shakespeare's, and she's an English teacher, so that was kind of a good recommendation for the book. So I picked up Henry V. I ended up getting the larger copy because it was all that Amazon had, which is disappointing because I really like the mass market paperback size copies of the Forger Classics library, but it is what it is. And for this book, I annotated it and I picked some colors that kind of match the cover. And the annotation guide that I made included the topics of war slash battle, wisdom, poetic lines, romance, and insults, which I have found I must always include when I annotate a Shakespeare book because Shakespeare had some of the sickest bones in literature for sure. So that's just what my annotated page looks like at the front to give me kind of a clue as to what each of the colors represents, because I will easily forget if I don't do a cheat sheet in the front of the book. So before I read a few of my favorite quotes from the book in each of the sections that I chose to annotate, I just want to do a quick summary of what I liked and what I didn't like as much in Henry V. Things I liked include that it's kind of the main plot of the book is kind of like a war between France and England. And as I was reading it, I kept thinking of A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, which is my favorite Charles Dickens book and a book that I really enjoyed to read. And so, because Henry V reminded me of that book, I really enjoyed that, and it really made me want to go back and reread A Tale of Two Cities after I've read this. Another thing that I really liked about Henry V was that I found Henry V, the titular character, to be a really interesting character. My aunt was trying to explain the book to me because I should have read like a Spark Notes summary or something before I read it. I've discovered that if I have a general idea of what the book is about when I go into it reading Shakespeare, I get a lot more out of it and find it a lot more enjoyable. I went I went into Henry V knowing absolutely nothing about it except that it was like a history. That was the only thing I knew about Henry V. And so my aunt was trying to kind of explain the general plot to me, even though she hasn't read the book in a considerable while. So that was fun. But she was kind of explaining Henry V, how he was like this kind of rebellious, reckless youth, and that he inherited the crown and then had to manage the kingdom and do so in a time of war and um, kind of make people believe that he was responsible after he had spent so long being reckless and all of that. And so that description I kind of picked up little bits and pieces throughout the book. I definitely intend to watch the play that my Shakespeare and the Parks Company is going to do, and then also find a good film adaptation of Henry V in the future to watch. So, if you have a recommendation for a good film adaptation, leave it in the comments below. Because I think that would definitely help me understand it better, and then I can go back and reread it later in the future and get a lot more out of it. I did find Henry V to be an interesting character from what I did read. I felt like he was kind of he got a little bit of like character development throughout the book. I feel like Henry V as a play, there definitely wasn't as much character development as a play like Hamlet, for example, which I will get to that later, but that was one of the things I did not enjoy as much about Henry V as a play. One other thing that I really enjoyed about this book is that it had really interesting descriptions of war and very poetic explanations of war, which I thought was very useful as a writer. I can take that and use that as inspiration in my own books. And I just found it very interesting. And I liked the poetic way it was described, and um, it was done in a way that a lot of the Shakespeare books that I've read in the past, they don't go so deep into war. Like, it's not the main plot of the book. So this book was different in that regard, where war was definitely the main thing going on in the book, and it was described in a very interesting way. So, some things that I did not enjoy so much about Henry V. There were a lot of like paragraphs or pages full of French dialogue, and reading the Virgil's version of the book, I was immediately told in like the introduction that a lot of the French phrases are actually incorrect the way Shakespeare used them. They were like poorly like written by someone who did not really know French that great. And so there was that. And then I don't know anything about French. So reading the French phrases, it just made me stumble. And then I had to go to another page to find the translations of the French phrases. And it just pulled me out of the story and made it so that I wasn't able to get super involved in the plot of the story as I would if I didn't have to go look those things up. And that reminded me a little bit of in middle school having to read 50,000 Leagues? 50,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And all of the pages upon pages of like Latin names for like fish and fossils and things like that. And just how frustrating that is to read sometimes, because you're starting to get into the story and you're really enjoying it, and then you're just like yanked out of the experience of the book because of that language barrier that is there. So that was one of the things about Henry V that kind of threw me for a loop. And other Shakespeare ones I've written, they've quoted like Latin or French before, but it's never been to this extent as it was in this book. And so, yeah, it was a little hard to keep track of. I did not enjoy that part of Henry V at all. Another thing that I was not crazy about on Henry V as a play was the romance. And I've heard and I read like in the introduction to it that the romance in this book is very controversial because it is kind of it's an arranged marriage, and it's kind of not that great of a situation. And some people are like, oh, it's really sweet. My aunt thinks it's really sweet, and she chooses to see it that way. And I have heard other people just think that it's kind of messed up. I don't really hold that much of an opinion on that regard. What I didn't like about it was that it felt so rushed. Um, it kind of made it sound like Henry always wanted a marriage with Catherine out of the war. Like that was what he was striving for, was a treaty through marriage. And that was like insinuated in the dialogue towards the end in the final act. But I don't feel like it was foreshadowed very well. Or maybe that's just my understanding, because I had a little difficulty understanding this book, to be completely honest. But I felt like the romance was definitely rushed and not the final act. It was like all about that, and it made it sound like it was kind of always meant to be about that, and I just didn't see it. So I really liked the dialogue between Henry and Catherine, minus the part where Catherine is always stumbling over her English, and it's very distracting as a reader to see the broken French and the broken English and have to try to decipher what they actually mean by that very broken language sentencing. Um, but the quotes were actually very poetic and sweet. And if you think of it in a context that's not like he doesn't know her at all, then it definitely comes across as sweeter and very romantic. But I did feel like, as far as it goes for an arranged marriage romance situation, it didn't bother me. I feel like um, it wasn't strange that he was using poetic language to try to woo her, and I found that fitting. I just wish that it had begun maybe in the third act and then slowly happened throughout, um, or that it was a little dialed down since it did happen in the last act. I don't know, just my opinion. Something about Henry V that I didn't enjoy that much was the romance aspect of the book. And then the other thing is I feel like if you don't go into this book with prior knowledge, you're gonna be kind of confused. I was lost on what was happening until I had a conversation with my aunt, who had read the book and taught the book in one of her English classes, um, about what the plot of the book was supposed to be and what was actually supposed to be going on throughout the book. And so I feel like it would have definitely been easier as a reader to read it knowing a little bit more about Henry's past. And this is something that I feel like Hamlet did really well, where it was, you don't go deeply into Hamlet's past, but you get all the information you need to understand that he's like returning from college, he's coming back, and he's got his college friends that he's familiar with, and while he was gone, all this drama was happening in his family. All of that is very well explained in Hamlet. And Henry V, I think the main plot, from what I understood, was that Henry was having to kind of prove himself as a king after a youth spent in recklessness and rebellion. And I feel like without the context going into the story, I probably would not have figured that out through the cues given throughout the story. So that was something that kind of threw me off a little throughout the reading of Henry V. And the final thing is just that the final act really felt rushed. There's this huge like war being built up throughout the book, and the characters are being introduced and um, getting development or dying or whatever happens to that particular character. And then you get to the last act, and it's like, okay, the war's over, the treaty's signed, Henry is set to marry Catherine and Finney. And I just feel like it went by really fast, and some of that stuff could have been dealt with maybe at the end of like Act 4, and then in Act 5 it would have been a little more of a resolution, like slowly, as opposed to just ramped up to 100 to get through to the end of the book and explain everything that happened and how everything was resolved. So that was something about Henry V that I wish was done a tiny bit differently, just that it was a little slower at the end, because it was hard to keep up with. Okay, so now I'm going to read a few quotes from Henry V that I really liked, that I annotated in my copy of the book. So I have the topics again of war and battle, wisdom, poetic lines, romance, and insults. I'm going to read a little bit from each section, starting with the wisdom slash poetic lines section. They kind of overlap a little bit. So one of the quotes I really enjoyed was, "Yea, at that very moment, consideration, like an angel, came and whipped the offending Adam out of him, leaving his body as a paradise to envelop and contain celestial spirits." And this is kind of talking about how this is the Bishop of Canterbury. It's kind of a meeting between several of the bishops, and they're talking about Henry V. And the Bishop of Canterbury is saying that when the old king died, Henry V had like the consideration that he was king now, and it beat the rebellion and recklessness out of him, the offending Adam, and left him as someone who was a good candidate for the king, to be the king. One of the quotes that I really enjoyed on the topic of war slash battle was this: "Sword is an oath, and oaths must have their course." So this is Henry V's friends, old friends talking, and his friend Pistol says this line. A few of the people are having a this is a very comical section in Henry V, and this is the section which led me to go talk to my aunt and be like, okay, what's going on in this story? Because I am lost. I have no idea what's happening. Because Baldorf, excuse my pronunciation of that, and Pistol, who I believe both, I know that Pistol is, and then Nim and Baldorf, they're like friends of Henry V's, and they're like insulting each other, and then they go to duel, and then they stop the duel, and then they recommence the duel, and it's just, I think it's supposed to be a comical scene. I definitely saw it that way, as a comical type display, but I just like that line. I'm sure it was supposed to have been said in jest, and I'm sure I'll get some of the context for this when I see the play and see how the actors portray the scenes, which is really the way Shakespeare is meant to be um, experienced, is through that form of play. But I also found it really interesting, just as a concept in the theme of battle, is that drawing his sword, sheathing his sword, it's a oath, and you must abide by that oath. Once the sword is drawn, it can't be put away. In that kind of understanding of the quote. Another poetic line that I found that I believe may have originated from this play, and that's why I highlighted it, is "Once more onto the breach, dear friends, once more," said by King Henry. And I think this must have been where this quote originated. I've heard it other places, movies, other books, I'm pretty sure. And I was just think it's cool when I'm reading Shakespeare and I come across one of those lines where I'm like, I think this is where this line came from. And it's just one of those very poetic lines that is descriptive of war, and I just think it's very cool. And here's another poetic line that is sung by Pistol, who is surprisingly poetic for such a ruffian in the plot. He says, "And sword and shield and bloody field doth win immortal fame." I don't think I really need to say more on that line. I just enjoy it. I think it's interesting. Another one in the idea of war slash battle. "The Duke of Exeter is as magnanimous as Agamemnon, and a man that I love and honor with my soul and my heart, and my duty and my life, and my living and my uttermost power. So, I'm so bad at the names in this book. It really is a challenge for me, these like French names. But uh, Fluellen, I think that's how it's pronounced, is having a conversation among the captains of the English and the Welsh. And he's describing the Duke of Exeter as someone like Agamemnon from the Iliad, the king. So that caught my attention because I just read the Iliad not that long ago. And I just thought it was a very poetic line. Here's an insult because the Shakespearean insults are the best. This is from Orleans. If their heads had any intellectual armor, they could never wear such heavy headpieces. I just love Shakespearean insults. I need to have like a collection of them on standby for any and all conversations. Wisdom slash poetic line is from King Henry. Gloucester, 'tis true that we are in great danger. The greater therefore should our courage be. I really like that. King Henry also said, every subject's duty is the king's, but every subject's soul is his own. So you have a duty to the king, but you still have possession of your own soul and what you think is right and wrong. Another one from King Henry. By Jove, I am not covetous for gold, nor care I who doth feed upon my cost. It yearns me not if men my garments wear, such outward things dwell not in my desires. But if it be a sin to covet honor, I am the most offending soul alive. And another from King Henry. One thing I noticed throughout this book is King Henry very much likes to hear himself talk. There are pages upon pages of dialogue that's just him talking to his advisors, talking to whoever he can get to listen to him, and he's a king. So that's pretty much everybody. The benefits of being a king, I suppose. And so he says, O God, thy arm was here, and not to us, but to thy arm alone, ascribe we all. When, without stratagem, but in plain shock and even play of battle, was ever known so great and little loss on one part and on the other. Take it, God, for it is none but thine. This is after they have won the war, and he's just pretty much saying that it's only by God's will that they won the fighting. And I just like the way that it's phrased. It's very poetic. And now we get to the romance. If you can see in my book, here's all of the stuff that I just read. And these like light tannish colored ones that there are all two of in the entire book is the romance. But there's several pages worth that is just all romance. And it's all crammed into the end. But there's some very poetic stuff in here, so let me read it. Henry says to Catherine, will you vouchsafe to teach a soldier tones such as will enter at a lady's ear, and plead his love suit to her gentle heart? And then he says, an angel is like you, Kate, and you are like an angel. He says, in faith, Kate, my wooing is fit for thy understanding. I am glad thou canst speak no better English, for if thou couldst, thou wouldst find me such a plain king, that thou wouldst think I had sold my farm to buy my crown. I know no ways to mince it in love, but directly to say, I love you. He says, Mary, if you would put me to verses or to dance for your sake, Kate, why you undid me. For the one I have neither words nor measure, and for the other I have no strength in measure, yet a reasonable measure in strength. I cannot look greenly, nor gasp out my eloquence, nor I have no cunning in protestation, only downright oaths, which I never use till urged, nor never break for urging. For those fellows of infinite tongue that can rhyme themselves into ladies' favours, they do always reason themselves out again. But a good heart, Kate, is the sun and the moon, or rather the sun and not the moon, for it shines bright and never changes, but keeps his course truly. He is very very poetic in his confessions of love to her. And I just think it's funny that he's like, I'll just say it plainly that I love you. And then he goes on to say all this, and he's like, men who rattle off at the tongue and don't say things plainly are easily dissuaded from their feelings. And then he goes on and just pages upon pages of like flattery towards her, which is a very Shakespearean thing to do, I suppose. He goes on to say several pages later, through much more flattery and romance, says, Harry of England, I am thine, which word thou shalt no sooner bless mine ear withal, but I will tell thee aloud, England is thine, Ireland is thine, France is thine, and Henry Plantagenet is thine. And then he kisses her. And that's pretty much the end. They get married, and that's the end, with the chorus entering and giving the epilogue about the war and etc. And take a moment to admire this beautiful copy of like the original play uh, papers. I just love those, seeing those at the end of these books. That makes me so happy. And I don't know if I've worn it in a video yet, but I actually have a Hamlet sweatshirt that's like the original playbill from Hamlet with the Globe Theater emblem on it. And I love it so much. I just totally geek out for that type of thing. So that's Henry V. Overall, I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. It was good. Definitely not my favorite Shakespearean play. I'm glad I read it though. It was kind of out of my comfort zone. I don't read a lot of the historical type ones. In fact, I think the only other one I've really read that could be deemed historical is Julius Caesar, which I don't really consider that one a true historical one because I feel like it's more of a tragedy. Um, it kind of fits both of those fields. I did enjoy it. I think I would have enjoyed it better if there was a little bit of a little more character development along the way. A little less French interspersed. I'm sure like the original audience probably enjoyed that because they probably all spoke at least a little French, and I do not, and I probably never will. So definitely not my favorite thing about Henry V. I would also say Henry V is not a good starting place if you're just getting into Shakespeare. If you're gonna read a history, if you that's what you're interested in Shakespeare, I would recommend Julius Caesar because I think it's an easy starting place as histories go. I would also recommend books like Hamlet and Macbeth and um, A Midsummer Night's Dream, even. Those I think are a lot easier to start with. This one was very hard to get into, and I think I will definitely have to read it again once I have watched a play adaptation of it and have a little bit better context to understand what was going on. So that's Henry V. If you have read Henry V, please leave a comment below and tell me what you thought of it, what your favorite and least favorite sections were. Or if you are a Shakespeare reader and you have any good historical recommendations for some of Shakespeare's historical plays, please add those below as well, because I definitely am looking for more Shakespeare. I feel like I've just brushed the surface and I really enjoy it and I want to read more. And if this is the type of video you like, please subscribe and like the video and follow along for more. I'll see you in the next one.